I want to thank Rob Bluey and the Heritage Foundation for the honor of being able to come here to this outstanding event and talk to you about my book. I appreciate it greatly. As Rob read that passage, that was the question I wanted to answer in my book. I was looking around last year and all these different areas where you see government trying to increase its control over our lives in very practical ways, very ways that where we're making decisions that have huge consequences in our life, including obviously in healthcare. So I try to prioritize those places that I thought were most important to our lives and where liberals are using government power to make the greatest inroads. At the same time, I wanted my book to be an answer to that practical question. I also wanted to explain the principles of limited government in our Constitution that I think are being violated, and the natural law moral principles that preceded the Constitution that the founding fathers of this country universally believed in, that I also think were being violated. And to explain at the same time I was explaining what I think is a lack of wisdom among current liberals in political power, to show how that contrasted so dramatically with the true wisdom of the people who founded our country. When you look at American history through this sort of practical question that I looked at in my book, you see there really was a dramatic pivot point. And that was in the 1930s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, when, like right now, there was a single political party that had power in the government except for the Supreme Court. You had Roosevelt's party controlled the White House and had dominant control of Congress. And at that moment is when the welfare state started to be created in the United States. From the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 until 1940, when Franklin Roosevelt was breaking George Washington's tradition and running for a third term as president, no American, unless they actually worked for the federal government, got their income from the federal government. The way, if you work for the government, you get your income, but everybody else didn't. But in 1940, that's when the first Social Security check started being doled out. The Social Security Act was passed in 1935. It had a Supreme Court challenge. It was sustained in the Supreme Court under very interesting circumstances, which I describe in the book in 1937. But it wasn't until 1940 that people started receiving checks when Roosevelt was running for his third term. And one of the most important things I think I talk about in my book, and I know that people at the Heritage Foundation have been talking about this same phenomena, is what I call the coming crisis of the welfare state. When you go back and you look at the founding of Social Security, there were some people at the time who were saying, look, we're not even paying for this. We're going to, aside from the constitutional question, and I argue in my book that Social Security is not constitutional, that the welfare state was not constitutional. But leaving that question, there's also the question of the practical fiscal ramifications of creating a system where people are dependent on the government for their income. Under Social Security now, we have a majority of people over the age of 65 in our country are dependent on the government for a majority of their income. With Medicare that was created in 1965, you have people over 65 dependent on the government for their health care. Now with Obamacare, they want to extend that idea in health care all the way down through birth. And if they recognize life from conception all the way down to conception, in fact, they'll use it to kill you with federal tax dollars before birth. But from the beginning, they were unwilling to tax away from the American people sufficient revenue to pay for these welfare state benefits they wanted to give. I think part of that was essentially a bribe on the part of pro-welfare state, liberal, control-freak politicians who wanted to be able to say to voters, here, I'm giving you something, and it's a lot more than I'm taking back from you. But by doing that, what they did was they kept on running a national debt. In fact, between the year when Social Security was enacted in 1935 and 1940, when they paid out benefits, and they started the taxes pretty much right away, the federal government was in deficit every single one of those years. So all of the original payroll taxes that were paid by the original recipients of Social Security are done with what your payroll taxes are doing now. Government got it, they spent it immediately, and then when they had to pay out the benefits 5 years later to the first retirees, they had to go borrow money to pay those benefits. And that cycle has been going on ever since 1940. Like I say, with Medicare and Medicaid put on top of it, with George Bush's Medicare prescription drug plan when President Bush was in office, and now we're going to have Obamacare on top of it. Now, what's the fiscal reality of this? The fiscal reality of it is, as the Peter G. Peterson Foundation has calculated using Treasury Department numbers, that as of the end of fiscal 2009, at the end of last September, the federal government faced $61.9 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That's the amount of the national debt plus all the entitlement benefits, primarily Social Security, Medicare, but others that are promised to Americans now alive that will not be met by the tax revenue that is anticipated to come in to pay for those benefits. That $61.9 trillion equals $200,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. So theoretically, what the government faces is going out and getting an additional $200,000 in revenue for every person in the United States. For a mom and dad and 3 kids, a family of 5, that's $1 million. As of now, the unfunded liability equals $1 million for that family of 5. When the Treasury Department came out with its financial report on the government of the United States back in February, and the Comptroller General who runs the Government Accountability Office looked at this, they said that as of 2019, they believe, 2019, that's 9 years from now, they believe that 92% of all the revenue coming into the federal government will go out just to pay the interest on the federal debt and to pay the entitlement benefits that are due that year, primarily Social Security and Medicare, leaving only 8% of all federal revenue just 9 years from now, just 8% to pay for the Defense Department, to pay for the Department of Homeland Security that's supposed to be securing the border, but isn't, to pay for the Justice Department, to pay for the State Department, to pay all the core constitutional functions of the government that the Founding Fathers intended the federal government to do are going to only have 8% of the tax revenue to be run on just 9 years from now. So what does that mean? That means that the government's going to have to go out and borrow massive amounts of money. And they're going to have to do it in ever greater amounts every year from there on out. If you look at the budget numbers that the CBO has calculated from President Obama's latest budget, they're predicting that by then we're going to have deficits again over $1 trillion. From now, the deficits are predicted to go down a little bit, but then they're going to start back up, and by 2019, they're over $1 trillion again, and they're just going up and up and up. So you hear politicians all the time say, this is not sustainable, but they don't explain what they're going to do about it, and they don't explain why it's not sustainable. And one of the points I make in my book is really at the root of it is the desire of people in government to make Americans dependent on the government rather than independent and self-sufficient and self-reliant. And they've built a system that cannot last. And people in this room, in this generation, people alive today are going to have to deal with this crisis. It's coming whether we like it or not. And I hope on the other side of that crisis, we come out as a country that is going back to our constitutional principles of limited government, is going back to the moral principles that preceded the Constitution, is going back to the idea of a country that is made up of individuals and families who are self-reliant and take care of themselves. And the last thing I'll say before I'll take questions is that one of the people, you have the Tea Party movement in America today. Everybody knows about the Tea Party movement. When you go back and you read what the Founding Fathers are saying at the time and after the Tea Party, you realize there really is something of the same spirit alive in America today. And when the Boston Tea Party happened at the end of 1773, after that in early 1774, the British, both the Parliament and King George III, decided, all right, we're drawing the line. We're going to precipitate a crisis with the Americans. And one of the things they did was they closed down the port of Boston. Very dramatic move. So the Boston Committee of Correspondence, what they wanted to do in response was have a total boycott of trade with Britain. And they wrote a letter, and they literally gave it to Paul Revere. This is Paul Revere's other ride before the one out to Lexington. And Paul Revere rode down to Philadelphia and New York and Philadelphia to try to convince the people there to join with the people in Boston in this fateful step of a total boycott on British goods, which some of the people there, quite frankly, weren't sure whether they were ready to do. But in Philadelphia, one of the leaders was a man named John Dickinson, who was a wealthy lawyer. He had a plantation in Delaware. He's a Philadelphia lawyer. He was famous for writing the letters of a Pennsylvania farmer. And they called together a convention of the counties, totally grassroots movement. They didn't call their legislature. It wasn't the courts. They called a convention of the counties. And each one of the counties in Pennsylvania sent delegates. And they decided that they wanted to send instructions to the Pennsylvania Assembly to agree to have a Continental Congress where they would meet. And they knew this was a very fateful step. It was a more prudent step and an intermediary step than some of the things other people wanted, but it was a fateful step, and they were going to take it.